finally Friday. It's Friday, Friday.
Thank God it's
Welcome back to the Friday Show, presented this week by the Maryland Jockey Club. This weekend, it's Pie Day at Laurel Park. More on that coming up. Plus, of course, we are going to talk about the big news in the horse racing industry this week, the doping scandal, the 27 indictments. But first, Ray, all anyone is talking about in the sports world and elsewhere is the coronavirus. This thing is moving fast. As we speak, leagues like the NBA have suspended their seasons. We have cancellation of basketball tournaments. But this is a fast-moving story. What do you think about the response so far from the horse racing industry to the coronavirus?
Well, I'm not going to speculate on what they should be doing. I'm assuming that every racetrack, every racing commission is looking at this, talking to health officials in their community, assessing the landscape and making decisions based on that. But I'm heartened to hear that there are other factors that are going on behind the scenes, and that includes the backstretch where a lot of people live. The people that take care of the horses. And I know that in New York, for example, a committee has been formed to deal with the possibility of what happens if an outbreak occurs in the backstretch, and you know how close people are back there. It would not be that unimaginable for a lot of the people who work on any given racetrack to become sick, and you need to have someone take care of the horses, for example.
Yeah, that's a big question. What happens to the horses if you have a mass outbreak on the racetrack? They have talked in New York about these plans going forward, maybe setting aside some dormitories. But all racetracks across the country are going to have to think about this. Horse racing is one of those sports you don't have to have attendance. And in fact, a lot of days during the week, not on the big days, of course, but a lot of days during the week, you don't have that much attendance. It's mostly simulcast. So it's not like the sport has to shut down.
Nothing would surprise me because of how fast this is moving, and how, I'm troubled by the acceleration of the numbers, and even more so troubled by the fact that there apparently aren't enough tests out there. So I don't think public health officials really have a good read on how many people may be sick already.
Exactly. And what is the arc of this thing? How far along down the road does it go? I mean, if you look at some of the other countries, 3 months at least. So that would put us in May and June, which is Triple Crown season. So how is this going to affect the Kentucky Derby? And if the Derby was tomorrow, I'm pretty sure there wouldn't be people going. I mean, 160,000 people. It would. So it's kind of depressing, frankly, but it's something we have to deal with.
Yeah, as I said last week, actually, that the issue came up during a financial analyst call with Churchill Downs CEO Bill Carstanjen. And what he said at the time was that we are monitoring other sporting events and talking to officials, health officials. And if he's monitoring other sporting events, he's seeing what's happening. Will it be much different 7 weeks from now? I don't know. What I'm hearing is that the numbers will get worse. The person that testified before Congress yesterday said that. So there are different scenarios. I suppose they could run the biggest race of the year before an empty grandstand. They could cancel this year's event, or they could postpone it till later in the year if things get better.
Yeah, there's a lot of unanswered questions right now. We don't know. We'll just monitor the situation and report on it appropriately. All right, let's move on to the big news from horse racing this week, which was the indictments, the doping scandal, the FBI's investigation. Let's start with your big takeaway from this.
Well, I'm going to use, they say the past is prologue. I'm going to use the Penn National investigation as a template for what happened earlier this week. And that is that this is just the beginning. When we heard the first rumblings out of Penn National that the FBI raided the backstretch and arrested some people. That kicked off what really has been a 6-year process of arrests, interrogations, information, further arrests, guilty pleas, and out of the Penn National situation, there was one jury trial, a federal jury trial, where trainer Murray Rojas was convicted of the same charge, misbranding of drugs, that many of these people arrested on Monday were charged with. So it's a very similar situation. The FBI officials will be interrogating the people who produce, distribute, and use these performance-enhancing drugs, and they will be going after other people as a result of those interrogations. I talked to somebody who's been through this process, and he said there's no wiggle room. When the federal government comes after you, you tell the truth.
And they're buttoned up on this. If you read the indictment, I mean, the proof is very damning, and there's wiretap evidence and recorded phone calls and things that you can't really get around. And that's the way the FBI does things. They have a sealed up case, and the statistics about those, like 90% of them plead guilty. So, I think that's what's going to happen probably in this case. I guess one of the takeaways I have is the response that we've gotten from various agencies. First, I want to say, the Jockey Club deserves credit here because they hired Five Stone's investigative team to begin looking into the possibility that there's rampant cheating in horse racing, and what they found kick-started this whole federal investigation. So the Jockey Club deserves credit, and the Water Hay Oats Alliance was pushing, hoping that the Jockey Club would put its resources into that because they want to get the cheaters out of the game. And there was a lot of pushback from them, and there's been a lot of pushback on us when we say things like there's rampant cheating in the game, it's going on, it's not being caught. Right. Now the naysayers have to, kind of have to be quiet. But I was a little disappointed in some of the response from the industry, kind of taking credit for this when this was an outside investigation by the FBI and other federal agencies, and saying, this shows we don't need federal legislation. Ed Martin from the ARCI said that specifically, which I find to be a joke, because this is exactly why we need federal legislation. But I don't want it to be the FBI. This is a one-off or a rare instance where we have the FBI investigating horse racing. They shouldn't be doing that. They should be catching serial killers and kidnappers and all the other things they have to deal with. There is, however, an organization out there that all they do is catch cheaters in sports, USADA, and that's what this bill would provide for horse racing, a full-time investigative unit.
That's right. And it was Five Stones, by the way, the group that was hired by the Jockey Club, that was hired as a private security firm to look into systematic doping of the Russian Olympic team at the Sochi Olympics. Five Stones turned over their information, and then we saw what unfolded afterwards as far as breaking down that very elaborate and organized cheating by the Russians. This is a serious group. They're headed by a former head of the Drug Enforcement Agency, I believe, and they take on big issues. They were hired by an anti-doping agency to look into Russia, and that's the kind of thing horse racing needs. We can't just think that the status quo is going to work when this all clears up and say, okay, we're going to go back to the way things were, and if we need the FBI, we'll give them a call, and sure, they'll just come in and clean things up. They are not going to do that. They're not going to come in and solve racing's problems every few years. That's a fantasy to think that that's going to happen. And
it's a fantasy to say that the system worked in this case from the inside, because it didn't. It took outside intervention to get this done. And that's why, again, I'm going back to that bill. I think this is a boost for the support of that bill. We're already starting to see that. The other thing that bothers me about some of the things I've heard, owners acting disgusted or saying they're disgusted that this was going on and they had no idea. Well, that's just a bunch of malarkey, because these people who hire high percentage trainers and there's enough buzz on the backstretch that everyone knows who is the bad guys. I'm sorry, you had to know, and don't come out afterwards and say you didn't know.
Yeah, and I'll even call somebody out on this. Dennis Drazen, head of Derby Developments that runs Monmouth Park, Jorge Navarro and Jason Service. It's like their playground in the summer. They've had so much success there, and in fact, Dennis Drazen has his horses with Jason Service, or he did until earlier this week. And when the Juice Man video came out with Jorge Navarro and company, Dennis Drazen came to his defense. So, there's a real problem. And if Barry Irwin wrote about this earlier this week. Who has the will to change things? Monmouth Park has not shown the will. If you just go up the road a little bit to the Meadowlands, Jeff Garral has shown the will. As a harness racing operator, he has tried to clean up that game as much as he can. I think he supported the Five Stones investigation too. He deserves a lot of credit for what he's done, but he's just one guy out there. This is an industry that has looked the other way to obvious form reversals that can only occur because of some form of breaking the rules. And you could talk to any number of handicappers, and they're all going to give you names of people that should be watched. And a lot of them were rounded up on Monday.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that people didn't know about this going on is ludicrous based on the evidence. It's just the eye test. You can see the unnatural things that occur on the racetrack, and you have to know that something's going on. But it takes boots on the ground, things like wiretaps. It takes people saying something on the backstretch. And that's one thing that I'm still concerned about, because we've heard comments on our website after this about people saying they're afraid. They're afraid for their job, their safety, if they say something. And that culture has to change. Those people that are threatening others have to be ferreted out, because that's dangerous, and it's a big problem that I think people are actually starting to talk about it because of these indictments.
Yeah, as I said, we're just at the start here. 27 were named. I understand there was another one added to it from the harness side a day or two later. This is just the beginning. Once they start talking to the people who have been arrested, started to make deals with them on reductions of sentencing. It took 6 years for the Penn National investigation from the time some vets were arrested there. They had a guilty plea a year later, or I think a month later, they pleaded guilty. They weren't sentenced for almost 6 years, because over that 6-year period, they were still providing information. So this is going to be a long, drawn-out process. But the big question is, what will we have at the end here when this is all over? Will we go back to the status quo, or will we support something like the current bill, the Horse Racing Integrity Act, that would put everything under one roof?
Well, let's ask that question with our poll this week. Will this garner enough support to get something like the Horse Racing Integrity Act passed? Share your thoughts at PaulickReport.com. Ray, Laurel Park, Saturday is a big day. 314, it's Pi Day, celebration of the mathematical equation, and a celebration of horse racing as well.
Yeah, there's some big stakes races out there. I think it's 4 stakes, $400,000. It's nice to have, we all look at the Derby preps as big days of racing, and it's good that there's some races for older horses as well. Pi Day, watch it on TVG or bet it on your ADWs.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the Friday Show. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll talk to you next time.